Um, Thanks for coming to tonight's talk. Really pleased to have Allison and Stewart from Design with Company today. As you know, Stewart is the current Hyde Chair visiting professor here at UNL, teaching a studio in the master's program right now, and I think most of his students are kind of right there. I'm sure that was an assignment to be here. Anyway, we're also pleased that Allison could join Stewart for his lecture, which is a real bonus for you guys. So Allison is a visiting assistant professor at UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago. And she's also taught at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, Illinois Institute of Technology, and University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. She has a number of years of experience practicing in various different architectural firms and design build practices in Chicago, Princeton, and Champaign. And she's also a fellow of the McDowell Artists Colony. If you don't know what that is, it's a very prestigious art residency program in the East Coast, and is the recipient of numerous architectural awards from the Van Allen Institute and Architizer. And Stewart Hicks, the Hyde Chair professor, is also assistant professor of architecture at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he received his Master of Architecture from Princeton University. You probably know where that is, and is a fellow of the McDowell Artist Colony as well as Allison. He's a recipient of, am I getting louder as I talk? Okay, it sounds weird now. Stewart is a recipient of Architectural Records Design Vanguard Award a number of years ago, and also the Young Architects Forum Prize. These are both very prestigious international awards. Stewart and Allison practice under the name Design with Company, having founded this practice in 2010. The office has received quite a lot of recognition lately, including being named a Next Progressive by Architect Magazine, and included as one of Chicago's next generation in Architectural Record magazine. Design with Company received a 2014 grant from the Graham Foundation to study architectural character in the rural Midwestern United States. And they were honored by inclusion in the recent 2015, the very first Chicago Architecture Biennale, or biennial, I guess, it's not Italy. And the latter, which I happened to see in December, was a fantastic show of, I don't know how many participants, hundreds it seemed like. But the New York Times picked Design with Company's installation as one of the top 4 picks in the entire show, which is a really pretty impressive recognition. And if you went to this show, it went on and on and on and on, but a lot of great work and really prominent practices. So the two of them write that they are interested in concepts shared between architecture and literature, including narrative fictions, type, and character. And one could argue, though, that these are facets of architecture, or have always been facets of architecture, but they've been sort of pushed under the rug by more familiar aspects of architecture that we talk about most of the time: form, composition, space, and function, and some of the other similar obsessions of modernism. Instead, Design with Company says that they like buildings that have a story. They don't like to limit themselves to what the world should be, they write, thus repeating what we already know. Instead, they write, we produce what could be, exploring and expressing new potentials and opening up new possibilities. And I'm sure you will agree that this work reintroduces the notion of pleasure back into the discourse of architecture. It's okay again to have fun. And I'm sure you will be quite happy to know that that this lecture will be a fun and enjoyable experience, I hope. No. Thanks, and welcome.
We didn't say that. Thank you. It's a lot of pressure.
I know. You guys ready to have fun? Just in case it's not clear by looking, I'm Stewart Hicks.
I'm Allison. Newmeyer.
And it is an honor to serve as the Hyde Chair this year. My application centered around thinking critically about the Midwest and its architecture, which we want to do today by telling you guys some stories, showing you some of our favorite buildings, and talk about what it might mean for architecture to learn from the Midwest. We'll begin by showing some of our early work, which is more speculative in nature, that uses narrative as a kind of context for a building to be designed, and then move to some of our later work where we attempt to try to translate some of these sensibilities that we were curating in the kind of speculative early work into something that could be built projects in the world. And so when we began working together in 2010, we were living in the middle of Illinois in a place called Urbana, which is surrounded on all sides by cornfields, and while we were teaching at the University of Illinois. And our first instinct as we set out to kind of start this architectural adventure together was to ask ourselves how we could make this place that we were in the coolest place around. This place in the rural Midwest, how do we make it cool? Because we always want the place that we're in to seem like it's where the party's at. So we asked ourselves, what does the Midwest have to teach architecture? What does it mean for architecture to learn from the Midwest? And our first stab at this exercise was just to think about what is our favorite building in the Midwest and what does it do?
This is it. It is the world's only corn palace in Mitchell, South Dakota.
So just look at it. Let's soak it in. It's really beautiful, I know. Many of you might have been there because it's not that far from here. But at first glance to maybe outsiders, it probably looks a little strange. It's decorated with onion domes, minarets, and various murals of various depictions on it. The building was designed in 1921 by the Chicago architects Rapp and Rapp. They're mostly famous for doing a number of theaters around the Midwest. So they did the Chicago Theater or the Fisher's Theater in Detroit. And so we think it's interesting and to note that architects known for theater designs designed this building. USA Today declared, however, that this building of theirs was one of the top 10 places in America to play high school basketball. That's only one of the reasons why we like it. Its purpose was to write a new narrative for the town of Mitchell through architecture. And it did this by showcasing the fertility of the soil and encouraging people to settle on it. The people of Mitchell looked to architecture as a means to reframe an aspect of their daily life, and in this case, the ground, and to celebrate it as a means to produce an identity for a territory where there was no identity previously. The building performs by serving as a canvas for a series of mosaics made from ears of corn. Every year, the mosaics are reassembled according to a theme and are composed from 12 strains of corn, each with a unique color. It takes about 50 acres of land to produce the necessary corn for 1 year's worth of murals. There's even a corn webcam where anyone can tune in to see the status of the corn murals at any given time. In this way, there's a deep dependency between the surface of the building and the surface of the ground upon which Mitchell sits. Each are a projection of the other. The building is a concentrated and composed vertical version of the horizontal.
And so at the conclusion of the corn mural decoration, there's an event called the Corn Palace Festival, and it takes over the entire town of Mitchell. There's concerts, carnival rides, and food trucks. So here's a building that gives an identity to a collection of people by celebrating and reframing from its everyday life. Its impact is many times greater than its physical footprint. And it has its own festival, which is kind of cool. The building is a performance, and we think that's really incredible. It's a dream on display, and it gives something a chance for others to rally around, despite the fact that everyone can see behind the curtain.
And so we might think of buildings not as a text, as previous generations might have, but instead as a performance. And buildings can fold their audience into their narrative, allow people to become part of the performance in an architecture that celebrates the everyday while producing alternatives to it. Or you can celebrate corn in Mitchell, South Dakota, where buildings and the people can get into character. And so working backward from our starting point of one of our favorite things, we had to give it a kind of architectural backstory. Back to a forgotten or a kind of under-considered thread of architectural thought that the Midwest could contribute something to, so we could understand its lessons within a broader disciplinary framework. And we think that this conversation has to include the French architect Jean-Jacques Lequeux, who, in addition to designing a number of speculative buildings, would dress up as various characters and record how he did it through drawing. He studied expression and contortion within his face rather than the static classical beauty of geometry, and he translated these ideas into architecture. We also like to think of Jean-Jacques Lequeux as a kind of being in character, or thinking about architecture as in character. So he physically got himself into character, as well as thinking about buildings in this way, which I'd like to kind of consider in relationship to the Corn Palace in Mitchell, South Dakota. And this idea of an architecture that is in character has a kind of double meaning. If something is in character, or someone is in character, that means that they're playing a part in a fiction, that they're a kind of fictional entity within a fictional world. But also, something that's in character means that it's in line with our expectations for it. If something is in character with its surroundings, it fits in. And so this kind of dual notion that it at once is kind of playing part in a fiction, but at the same time is completely in line with our expectations for something, is something that we think architecturally has a lot of value and that we could explore in various ways.
So we started to dive a little deeper into understanding Lequeux, and we couldn't help but notice there is a lot of similarity to some buildings that we found around us in the Midwest. In both, there are fantastical mixes of older heterogeneous elements with collages of styled parts and formal quotations. These all come together with visible seams between them. So we thought to ourselves that the Midwest seems like a good case study to understand the extension of Lequeux's work. And this idea of architecture that is in character is central to it, because in the Midwest, there's too much space and too few characteristics. And therefore, it deploys architecture to produce new narratives and identities for places and collections of people. Lequeux's buildings took on the appearance of things from outside the domain of architecture, which remain legible in elevation. So he searched for idiosyncrasy by a wonderful mixture of things like transformed everyday features, theatrical fantasies, symbolism, or things like buildings that look like a cow. And the Midwest equivalent to this might be Salem Sioux on the right, which is the world's largest cow in North Dakota. He used fragments that are sampled, scaled, rotated, flattened, and recomposed. For instance, porticos on the top of columns, or pediments that don't go all the way up or across, creating a kind of misalignment of symmetry. And this looks an awful lot to us like the Mars Cheese Castle, which is in Wisconsin, where cheese is so important that they build a castle for its display. And curiously, this castle kind of deploys some of the same design tactics. And the overlaps between them and Midwestern constructions are uncanny, kind of like we're living in realized dreams. And we kind of want to live in those fantasies.
So we have embarked on a project to kind of learn from the Midwest, and that's kind of the largest, or that's the large theme of our practice. To look around at some found conditions, to learn how architecture might behave in new and unexpected ways. And so if we look west to learn from places like Las Vegas, we find lessons for architectural communication and signage. If we look east and learn from places like a delirious New York, we find lessons about collectivity and about program. Naturally, between those, we find evidence for how they might come together, where architectural communication and figuration can produce new collective identities.
So one of the first projects that was kind of our learn from the Midwest was a speculative concept for a chain of agro-tourist resorts sprinkled across the American countryside. So this is working with a critical theory of the Midwest within the Midwest, and we'll show some examples of kind of exporting it later. This is Farmland World. It is part theme park and part working farm. It's set out to capitalize on both investments in high-speed rail and farm subsidies. It's a network of resorts that combines crowdsourced farm labor with ecotainment. The resort is patrolled by a series of farm implements that they complete traditional farm tasks, but they also provide a techno spectacle for the people that are riding the high-speed rail. They're called animal farmatures. There's a whole flock of them. So, and this was kind of coming off of the high-speed rail prompt. So our take on it was that initially the iron horse or the locomotive captured the imagination of Americans as a human-machine-animal hybrid. It subjugated the pastoral landscape to the ingenuity of human invention. In addition to conquering space and time, the train was a new viewing mechanism that transformed the environment into a moving picture show through isolation, speed, frame, and montage. And now we've come full circle. So here the cow combine in its native habitat is seen from the passing train. He's providing entertainment during the long ride through the middle. The pink one is showing a little excitement by spewing some corn, and the green one is giving you a little wave. No, it's more like this. So the parts of the cow combine articulate to both work the land and entertain. For instance, the bladder does the irrigation. The belly holds the fuel. The head and ears articulate so that they can harvest the land and show excitement. And the tail articulates for the exhaust.
Not above fart jokes.
So we think that the farmachers would be at home at events like some of these. On the top is PorcoPalooza, where pigs are put on display and the possibilities are explored. Or agricultural expos, where the machinery created to cultivate the land has its own cult following. So the objects typically kind of valued for their efficiency and production are objectified and lusted over. So if we go back to the section of Farmland World, you can see the kind of section of the cow combine below, but above it is a kind of vast amphitheater that looks over these kind of staged farm-related events. It's a gassy turnip, and it's composed of 2 mini farmhouses. Each one's unique, but they're part of a family that we call the Farmhouse Bull Hotel. The pasture arena in the center creates a space similar to what you might see at PorcoPalooza or an ag expo, but here participants can experience the similarities between animals and machines. And if you look up at the scoreboard, you might notice that for today's activities,
It's Roger Federer being really excited about milking a cow.
all right. So the organization of the plan creates adjacencies between the visitors, machines, and animals. The central kind of area is the pasture arena where those events take place, like Roger Federer milking a cow. Kind of moving on, there are 8 kind of main spokes for the Farmland World that serve as docking stations for the farmachers, so they can kind of come in and dock in the evening. There's a few different kind of farmachers in the flock. In addition to the cow combine, there's the pig plow and the chicken silo feeder and the sheep baler and others. The docking station has a connection to the arena, which gives the farmachers a chance to kind of see what's going on. And then the adjacencies to the docking stations deal with what kind of program serves that animal. So on one side of the cow combine is an ice cream parlor, but on the other side is a steakhouse. And then sitting within the poche of those 2 things is the kind of real animal counterpoints.
Yeah, so here's
Right
where the
here.
real animals are, the animal farmachers, and then things like, so this is where the sheep baler goes, and this is where the sweater store is.
Yeah. And the sheep are in between.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they can kind of peek out and see their robotic mirrored selves. And so that might look something like this. For instance, guests have the opportunity to kind of get close to the real animals and the robots. You can pet them, you can become friends with them, you can pick your favorite, whether it's based on if you would like to eat it or ride it.
Or both.
Or both. So to kind of summarize this project, the robotic performers extend the tradition of machines using and mimicking animals while creating a majestic, reconstructed terrain of roaming beasts.
And so our work includes these kind of design projects as well as writing projects that accompany these, and we're always interested in the relation between text and buildings, or text and objects. And our recent publication is called The Misguided Tactics for Propriety Calibration, which is some of our recorded discoveries about the Midwest. But we didn't just kind of make a catalog of situations that we found. Instead, what we did was that we pretended that that a certain set of Midwestern constructions followed some sort of guidebook or some rule book to tell you how to create this kind of idea of Midwestern architecture that is in character. And so this mythical guidebook inside of our book then is a kind of retroactive set of design standards for Midwestern architecture. But the punchline is that we never actually show you what's inside of the book. Instead, we focus on the evidence of its existence and the drama that led up to its necessity. And so the format follows Lecaux's fragmentary architectural logic into a form of literature called collage fiction, which pairs collages with short bits of texts. Again, kind of thinking about a kind of particular relationship between image and text, and in this case, kind of exploiting a tonal counterpoint between them, where the text may not fit exactly with our expectations that the image is setting up for us. And so the story begins.
The eventual publication of Midwestern Standards for Propriety Calibration has its humble beginnings in the combination of three independent institutions. From top to bottom, they are the Midwestern Casting Agency, the Institute for Reduction and Enlargement, and the Redundancy Assurance Company Co.
There's too many of them. Each institution was devoted to tallying and standardizing the Midwest through the precise measurement of its geography. They used the latest techniques.
And they loved the grid.
Who doesn't? The Midwestern Casting Agency drew and redrew the boundaries of the Midwest. No one could decide on the best shape.
The Institute for Reduction and Enlargement measured deviations within 1 mile squares.
The Redundancy Assurance Company Co. counted and classified the squares trapped within the web of the Jeffersonian grid.
The three institutions initially didn't think to communicate with one another, and thusly the definition of the Midwest was in constant flux. Determining the most appropriate definition of the territory was the topic of conversation at all the most lavish parties.
Emotions were mixed among natives over the confusion about the constitution of their homeland.
In order to find a solution, the three institutions eventually united to create a full-scale standard square mile they called the culture. This 1 mile area square contains everything it means to be the Midwest. It's a 1-to-1 scale sampler of Midwestern geography and settlement patterns.
And this sampler is an average of an average mile of everywhere USA. But the way that it's reframed through these sampled parts makes it look anything but average, and it looks a little bit more like a fairy tale land. It is also home to the newly combined institutes which formed the conglomerate called the Institute for Quantity, Scale, and Image, which in our narrative is the mythical institution which regulates the character of the Midwest. Its home in this everywhere land is a patchwork quilt where various attractions of the Midwest are reinserted in ways that challenge or extend their metaphors. So for instance, the corncob buildings in Chicago are actually found in a cornfield, or the world's largest fish is found in an actual pond, or White Castle is guarding a hill. So this is about a 10-foot square mile, where which is complete kind of sampling of the Midwest, but all in their accurate scales. So there's the correct amount of farming to like the scale of the territory of the Midwest. There's the correct amount of city, which you can see over on the right, or the correct amount of parks, yeah. So this idea that it's a kind of datascape in a certain sense, but it's a datascape that presents a kind of alternative view of the reality by recomposing it in different ways. And again, just kind of highlighting this idea that by kind of putting them together in this way, the Midwest feels like a sort of, again, a kind of patchwork quilt of narratives that seem to be colliding and bumping into one another. And so that kind of takes us to our contribution to the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And our contribution was called a late entry to the Chicago Public Library Competition. So the public library competition was held in 1987, and it produced this building, which is called the Herald Washington Library, which was completed in 1989. So it went from the Cultural Center in Chicago to this building, and the Cultural Center was the hub of where the biennial was. So our model, which was rethinking this institution that used to be in the Cultural Center, was actually sitting in the Cultural Center. It was a controversial choice for a number of reasons, this building, which include its history, the way it deals with the city and public space, as well as, let's be honest, just the way that it looks. It boils down history into a series of simulacra, or simulations, and an endless pastiche, or kind of collage of different associations. Many of the library's design elements are kind of brazen imitations of features of Chicago landmarks, which themselves sport details derived from old world European buildings. Nothing is subtle about the library's references. A recent critic writes, "The illusions look comically oversized, as if to beef up these largely European motifs as one would cars or sandwiches for Midwestern Americans." And in a way, the building is a kind of patchwork quilt of conflicting narratives into itself. And so we think that this, although this building may be offensive to some, we think that there's something quintessentially Midwestern about it. And so we wanted to embark on thinking about these themes. And so we appropriated this late entry sort of format, which was pioneered by people like Klaus Oldenburg, or later refined by architects like Stanley Tigerman. Stanley Tigerman is an architect in Chicago, and he, in 1980, held what he called the late entries to the Chicago Tribune Tower competition. And so this has a kind of Chicago history to it, this late entry. And so we wanted to make a kind of connection between the Chicago Tribune Tower competition, which was also a controversial choice, with the Chicago Public Library competition. And in 1987, there was an episode of PBS series, Nova, where Stanley Tigerman is quoted by saying, very unflatteringly about the building, "By selecting that scheme, the winning design for the Chicago Public Library, it sends Chicago backwards, away from its own future, precisely the way that the Tribune competition and the Columbian Exposition did. Because it is a building that's a study in dissimulation, that feigns to be something of a time that it is not ours, that uses as a role model the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris by Henri Labrouste, that's the problem with the kind of thinking that uses context to establish authority and uses verification of an earlier time to get over the insecurities of the natives of a city trying to seek authenticity." Yeah, so he didn't like it much. We're all dumb for liking it.
So our revisiting of the original competition wasn't necessarily to say that Chicago got it wrong, but instead, for us, it was a chance to rethink how we use history and how we establish authority and construct our own narratives of a place. So while doing the research of the original competition brief, we went through the archive of the competition, which is now in the library. And we found these kind of public comments. For the original competition, there were 5 models that were displayed for around a month, and the public came in to view it, and they were given comment cards. They thought that they had an opportunity to pick the library, which they didn't.
In Chicago political
right.
way.
But so we read through all of the public comments. There were like over 1,000. And it was kind of entertaining. Some were insightful, some were funny, some were prophetic, such as one that read, "Chicago should have no spaceship slash Star Wars," which is funny to us right now because there's debate about the George Lucas Museum. Everybody's calling it the Star Wars Museum, and they don't want it.
Chicago never wanted Star Wars.
Never. So we produced 24 reactions, each to 24 late entries to the library, each with their own narrative. Many try to make a bad situation and turn it into something positive. Some might be read as satirical, while others whimsical and joyful. So maybe just a couple to talk about. There's one that we called Escalating the Library, which was a big requirement for all of the proposals. I think in the second paragraph of the competition brief, it said you should have escalators running all around, escalator. And so, and that's also a big critique of the building now, is that you have to take 3 flights of escalators just to get to the library. So we made one out of escalators. We made one as a kind of throwback to the Louis Sullivan Transportation Arch. The library now kind of steals or looks to the Art Institute, which was part of the same Columbian exposition. So we said, well, let's try to kind of look back, but to something that was maybe looking forward instead of something that was already looking back.
Or Hoo, which takes these owls that sit on top of the building and says, well, what if we take the kind of main feature of the building that everyone kind of admits is cool and just blow it up to become the entire building and make it all out of owls?
All owls. A couple of other ones. We thought we'd just take apart the cultural center and reuse those parts to make a new library. The terrarium, or the upside, is the best part of the library downtown is that the best space is on the roof and no one ever goes there. So we kind of moved that down. Or this was our homage to Stanley Tigerman, one called the Titanic, where we sunk the library.
Which is a reference to this image that Stanley Tigerman famously made, where he proposed sinking Crown Hall. So this is called the Titanic, and we have our own Titanic here.
So our installation at the biennial did consist of a drawing and two main models. The main model is a collage of the 24 entries and a pile of narrative-driven forms. A new building as a city of conflicting stories. And each entry is at 1 to 500, which is also the scale of the site model. So any one of those entries you could pick it up and move it into the site model to kind of play on scale.
Not literally.
Well, you could.
Yeah, conceptually.
Well, we didn't glue them down. We didn't tell anybody.
So it's this idea that it's a play on scale, like that the building is made up of things that are too small, all kind of glom together, but then as a model kind of also pushes that idea of scale.
So the stories of the model are kind of allowed to collide into new forms and arrangements. Just a couple right here on the bottom is the Sullivan Transportation Arch. We also had one that had used the Trump sign as naming rights.
The bottom of the owls hold up the 6th entry, which was never opened, which is topped by the Ferris wheel that's being dismantled at Navy Pier. Or the Prentice Building, which is a controversial building that got demolished, being shipped off on an aircraft carrier. Or the Titanic, which you can see down here.
And so, something that surprised us about this project was that it really did kind of offer a lot of layers and a lot of kind of ways that you could read it. You could read it very quickly, but you could also kind of spend a little bit more time with it and get rewarded by kind of reading the backstory behind each entry.
And so that we think this is kind of the best way to appreciate the project while making discoveries as you explore it and constructing your own narratives and all the time laughing while thinking. And so that kind of concludes the first half of the lecture of the kind of speculative work. And then these last half, we want to present some projects that try to learn from the speculative work into things that we're kind of proposing in the world. Obviously, we're not proposing the biennial model as something we'd want built in the world. It sits as a kind of unbuilt structure and tries to prompt us to think about the world in a different way by remaining unbuilt. But in these, we wanted to translate that sensibility that we cultivated into something that we do want to see into the world. And so how could architecture operate as this kind of narrative-driven architecture about these colliding forms, and not just kind of sit as a model, but to engage people in different ways. And so we thought we've categorized these projects into 3 different types, or 3 different ways that we tried to do that. So one is contorted bodies, where projects that try to engage people in a very precise or a very intimate way to kind of get people to contort their bodies. Configured bodies, which we're trying to arrange people in space to give identity through collections of people. And then stage sets, so buildings that operate like a stage set in a different kind of context in ways that could prompt people to become characters in various ways.
And I think, so we were trying to put these into different categories, and I think all of them kind of fit differently in each one's, but these are the kind of bigger.
Yeah, so some kind of dial up one over the other.
Yeah.
And so this is the first one we want to show. It's a temporary theater at an artist colony called Ragdale, just north of Chicago. All these were done this last year. We stayed at this place, Ragdale, for about 6 weeks. It's supposed to be 4, with 9 of our friends to help construct and build this thing. The project consists of 2 primary components. There's the stage, and then there's the seating for the stage. And the seating is in the form of these large cushions. And each is a study in the architecture of a local prolific architect named Howard Van Doren Shaw, who is the architect and original owner of the Ragdale property. And the fragments these kind of fragments of the cushions are scaled from the architecture of Howard Van Doren Shaw. And they're all, at the conclusion of a performance, would be stuffed into this box, which is also the stage. So the stage is this kind of pen for all these little animals, or like a toy box for where they would get stored and then released for a presentation. We want to show this project primarily through a little video, which we have, which we made while we were there.
Action! Action! Stop! Stop! I knocked it over. It was the
She knocked it over. It was her Howard Van Doren shawl that knocked it over.
Open up this cupboard and you'll find a ball of everyone inside. Breathe life into articles and breathe in particles before our time. And now when it visions the object on the circle tip of mouse. Remember that the elements of blood and the water becomes a substance from. Remember that the rockets are assembled like an architect that builds a house.
What part of me is in this?
I'm good now.
How you feeling? You feeling good? You ready for this?
Sure. I'm ready for some questions.
All right. Don't make it awkward. Let me know if you feel uncomfortable. We're in a safe space.
Dragnet.
My favorite part of the Shawtown project is, again, the pillows. I just like how playful they are. And I think that, like, when we're finished and we have the gala, I think everyone will really just have a lot of fun with the whole thing.
What's your favorite part of the Shawtown project?
I mean, I personally tend to enjoy the construction.
What's your favorite part of the Shawtown?
Favorite part? I think it's the story with the kind of made zigzag roof truss was a good one. 400 pounds. We had to rent a genie lift and pretty much maxed it out. We had to engineer a 2x scrap box to hold it into place. It was kind of a big event. Wheeling it out, bringing it in, and had everyone kind of on board to raise it up. I think it was a pretty tense moment, but I also haven't really been outside in a couple of years since starting grad school, so I think that's good for me also.
To be or not to be. To be or not to be. To be or not to be.
What's been one of your most memorable experiences while staying here?
The evenings and generally have always been and still kind of stick with me.
It is like a fantasy land, right? There's like someone who cooks for you.
Is your favorite meal by Linda?
There's lasagna.
The lasagna was awesome.
The ravioli lasagna.
So yeah, we really like video as a means for describing architecture and thinking about architectural ideas. We like to make videos with most of our projects because they allow you to kind of explore its occupation in a way that a lot of other media don't. So, the cushions we think are a kind of example of contorted bodies because they're miniature building parts translated from hard things into soft things, which aren't necessarily conducive to being laid on. So people have to kind of configure themselves in new ways in relationship to architecture. And they may or may not know where these things came from, but it doesn't really matter as they start to get, are playful with these large cushions, which are heavy.
So moving on to the configured body category, our pavilion titled Belong Here Now, it configures and contains people as a performance. So we were approached by Airbnb to propose a public activation for Design Miami. And they asked for a space that would not be so exclusive. It would sit apart from the mentality of Art Basel and Design Miami with spontaneous kind of public events. And these events would be hosted by artists to engage any passersby and surprise them with what they called magical moments. Yes, we heard that word a lot. It's a place for people to go when they want to meet up with people but don't know where those people are. So our interpretation of that was to model this around a Greek agora, which is traditionally, it's a public urban space for democratic discourse. Our Miami version is a broken ring of columns that's accompanied by a series of lower furniture pieces. So the furniture pieces are configured in kind of various forms that snake around the agora. They take form in both objects within the space and outdoor rooms. They corral smaller groups of individuals and they become waypoints for people navigating the space. So the kind of main entry is on the right side. So the kind of top right furniture piece started out as a square, something we call now the sloppy square. But it kind of reaches out and kind of grabs people and lets them in. And so all of the kind of pieces twist around to kind of control the movement through the space. So they all vary in height, depending on if it's a bench, a table, or a counter. So it gives you a different interaction with it, rather like whether you're sitting on it or standing at it as a bar.
This is the most important one because it's what they use as the bar, which is
very important.
In the middle. And so also they, so as Allison mentioned before, they asked artists to do these hosted moments to activate the space in various ways. And so part of our prompt was to create a kind of framework or a stage set for these things to kind of operate within. And so one of them can be seen there, Yinka Lori?
Gloria.
What?
Gloria.
Okay. Who took these various pieces of furniture and reconfigured them and repainted them in various ways. And then that provided seating for the table, which was that long kind of aqua-colored piece that sticks out. And the artist activations produce new readings within the space. Like this one was an artist named Red who put in dozens and dozens of white balloons attached to various objects that had meaning for her to kind of create a canopy above the space where there was none. And this is another image with the co-founder of Airbnb, Joe Gebbia, and the artist there in the center, Red, kind of occupying the spaces in between the balloons.
Yeah. This is another one of those moments. Michael Birch Pierce was an artist that did sewn portraits. So he had people come kind of all day and he would sew their portraits, and by the end of the day or the end of the week he would have a series of tapestries that kind of registered all of the visitors to the pavilion. And this was, I think, the creepiest one. It was a robot that you had to kind of interact with and ask questions. So that was kind of it caused a lot of interest and intrigue.
Yeah, the mouth moved in this really creepy way. It was in that uncanny valley, you know.
It's
So
very-
uncanny valley is like if things look too close to reality but aren't, they're creepy. But like as they get further and further away, they get okay. So like teddy bears are cute, but like zombies are scary because they're too close. Like this was definitely in the zombie category.
This is too close.
It was a little too close. And so this is just a kind of image of it under construction, where the pieces are all kind of scattered about. And it almost kind of looks like Shawtown to us, and these kind of furniture pieces when they're in the wrong place. But all of these had to be built in Chicago and then shipped to Miami. And so we found very quickly that building things in a dry, cold climate and then shipping them to a warm, wet climate presents a certain amount of problems.
So at the same time that we were doing the Shawtown project before, we were working to get this project built in Vancouver, and this one is called Porch Parade. It also uses fragments of architectural components collected around a theme, and in this case, the theme around the competition brief was connection. So porches are kind of a liminal space connecting the inside to the outside. They connect people to the community. It's also an introduction, and Porch Parade ends up being all introduction, where the main course is kind of left up to your imagination. But what you do get from this is an object that's ripe with the potential to bring people together in new and exciting ways. The porch is an object that prompts associations with different people who visit the parade. It's been important in various times in various cultures for different reasons. Before air conditioning, it was a necessity as another room. During modernism, it was kind of associated with fresh air and healthfulness. The Victorian era, it was kind of a refuge from the backyard of smelly things. In Japan, the specific overhang of the porch creates both a corridor and also kind of brings the landscape into the house. British porches were a place of worship. Southern states, it's a symbol of power, and there's a little tension there. So there's a lot of different reasons that you might come to the Porch Parade, where the function of the porch can be any one of those, or you can kind of make up your own. So it's a collection of parts that are recognizable but made unfamiliar through repetition and a new context. So these are stills from the sitcom Scrubs. I don't know if anybody watches that show anymore. But the protagonist, JD, buys a lot of land, and he can't afford to do anything on that land, so he decides that he's just going to build a porch. And the porch allows him to enjoy the land in a way that he couldn't without it. So he could gather with friends, enjoy a protected outdoor setting, be neighborly, and none of this could be done on just the lot. So porches are the thing that visually connotes the function of a domestic building. And in this way, it's a visual and spatial introduction, a room between the inside and the outside. The idea of the betweenness saturates the porch, so it's between public and private, house and garden, community and neighbor. And so if the porch talks about the theme of connection in the competition, we also wanted to look at the city of Vancouver and find inspiration from the place. So one of our heroes, James Wines, of site architecture, constructed this installation as part of the 86 World Exposition in Vancouver. It was called Highway 86 Processional, and transportation and communication were the themes of the expo. So James Wines put objects for transportation in a frozen parade. They're removed from their context and painted white, which allows them to interact in unexpected ways.
And so for us, we got really excited because James Wines is one of our heroes, but we got to interview him as part of the Chicago Biennial, and then we just got an email the other day that we're going to be on a panel with him at MoMA. We're going to talk about some of his work, so it's like a dream come true.
Yeah.
Our head's about to explode. So this is an alternate view, kind of side view of the Porch Parade, and we're kind of lumping this into the kind of stage set category, where there's this kind of middle wall which divides the two sides of the different porches. And so the porches on either side don't necessarily correspond to the one on the other. They're at a slightly different height, different scale, different size, and so it creates a kind of complex spatiality as one passes from one side to the next. There's definitely some sort of there's some ancestors to this project. And one might be Charles Moore in his Piazza d'Italia, who also believed that buildings were a kind of performance. In this case, a collection of colonnade fragments that are allowed to interact and abrade, each with its own personality, context, history, and references. The project becomes a kind of collection of overlapping worlds that are hinted at by the fragment. And the misuse of scale allows the kind of presentation of elements that are recognizable but made unfamiliar. And so we were also kind of reading a little bit by Charles Moore at the time when we were doing this project, which might allow us to understand its origins. One particular essay figures pretty strongly, and it's talking about fairy tales, and it's Charles Moore's sort of theory about how to create fairy tales in our everyday life. And so he has this theory that, that architecture can do this, that it can kind of produce a kind of alternative world within our own world. And one of those ways is to produce a kind of really important introduction for something. And so he writes about the building on the left. With just those pieces made by columns and walls, we can introduce a choreography of the familiar and the unfamiliar. One such piece is the porch, like the porch on a fire station in Auburn, California, which perhaps has gotten out of hand and has become more important than the building behind it. But it serves as a powerful introduction, so that if there is magic in that garage, which I doubt, it has at least been properly introduced. And so we think of Porch Parade as, again, as all introduction. And so other maybe precedents for this project might be found in Haydick's Wall House, where Haydick is kind of thinking of architecture as a kind of performance, also thinking about the idea of display and collectivity. So in the Wall House, it's bisected by a single wall, where each of the kind of more public rooms is its own world, put on display on this kind of concrete canvas in its background as a kind of still life painting with this concrete backdrop.
And so the Porch Parade was similar in that it had a kind of central wall running the entire distance that allowed all of the porches to kind of attach to in different ways. And then never mind. So the coloring system is something that we were kind of interested in making this seem not like a series of different porches, but kind of one complete composure. So the reason that we went with the color gradient was to hopefully kind of break up and challenge that part-to-whole relationship. So every time it blends kind of in the center of a porch. So you don't kind of understand that as one object. And we worked with a scene shop in doing this project, which was kind of fun. There's a lot of movies that get made in Vancouver, so there's a lot of people that can build things quickly and nicely. So it was kind of a challenge getting the blended color, but they were really good at it because they were used to doing kind of like theater backdrops and movie sets.
Yeah, so another connection to stage sets. Mm-hmm. It was built by a scene shop. Another contribution to the project came from Arup engineers who donated their time and expertise to the project. So we took it to them in April, and they worked closely with us to make sure that it wouldn't fall over in a wind gust. Mm-hmm. So we thought of this project as a series of porches, but they thought of it as a giant sail because it would very, very easily kind of blow over in wind. And so they worked with us to figure out a way of building the thing so it wouldn't fall over, because they told us that normally a porch would have a house behind it to be able to hold it up, and here the porch doesn't work that way.
It's another porch.
Yeah, it's just another porch. So what they did was they started to think about it as a series of rings that went perpendicular to that wall. There's what they called a sail wall that would effectively broaden the footprint, and these kind of O-rings would connect back to a post inside of the wall. And then the bottom of that ring would be weighted with concrete. So there's about 20,000 pounds of concrete in this thing, in the bottom parts of those porches, and then within some strategically placed planters that ballast the thing down, because we weren't able to anchor into the concrete of the street. And so the whole thing had to be built off-site in modules and then brought on-site, but at the same time uses conventional framing materials and construction methods, because it was important for us that this thing could be donated to Habitat for Humanity, and it was, to build porches on houses for people. So it had to be built modularly and then be able to be connected on-site, which is also a bit counter to the way that we normally have to think about framing up of houses.
Right. So they only had, what, a week on site?
Yeah, there's only a week on site. So just some sort of more close-ups of the project. The project is conceived of and operates as a series of layers. And so these layers, sometimes you look from one thing into another. Sometimes that other thing is more of the Porch Parade. Other times it's the city beyond. So the building kind of frames the city in various ways, as well as framing itself. And so even though it's a very like easy initial move with this kind of one wall with different porches, there's a really complex spatiality that happens as you go from one to the next. And it becomes a kind of geometry problem in and of itself. Everything was connected to one thing, and if you changed even the height of the floor by a couple inches in one, it adjusted the pitch of all the porch, of everything. And so it's actually a really complex geometry problem at the same time as it's a kind of initial kind of clarity of move.
Yeah. And so we were really interested in the way that we saw people interacting with it that we maybe didn't expect. So here there's a gentleman that is kind of dressed as the same colors as the Porch Parade, taking a photo of a woman using it as a backdrop, but then right next to them there's a kid kind of climbing all over it, using it like a jungle gym. And it was a lot of fun to kind of follow it over the summer and see people posting things on social media when they were kind of dressed up in the same colors of the Porch Parade. They would take selfies, and yeah, it was the backdrop for a lot of selfies.
And we also provided a bunch of deck furniture for people to engage with it. So the rocking chair, as somebody's using. But again, this kind of layering that it's producing, and this effective layering as it frames the city in various ways. So this guy in the foreground kind of relaxing, doing what we'd expect people on a porch to do, versus a guy on the right buying some shawarma from a Mediterranean food cart, also in the same color.
It also matches the, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think like the way Stewart was talking about it framing the city and framing people, like I think that this is a really good example of a happy accident of when we took this photo and it was framing the people, but it also kind of puts them on the wall. So it's a way of kind of taking things in the city and kind of putting them into the porch.
Yeah, so it's like a flattening device at the same time as the kind of depth. There's a kind of depth to the porch as well as this kind of flatness through the framing.
And even these people on the left are, instead of sitting kind of looking out to the city, they're sitting looking out to the city through this frame.
Yeah, so they're like looking into the house, but outside and snuggling as they do it. So in conclusion, we've been working to translate a sensibility that we think is uniquely Midwestern. Translate that from speculative projects located in the Midwest to built projects that can be anywhere. At their heart, there's a unique combination of superficiality and sincerity, where the porches are a stage set that provides authentic experiences and allows for a collision of multiple narratives to coexist as the architecture and people experience it are all in character. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'd be happy to take questions. We were prompted to note that the recording can only pick up our voices, so we're going to have to repeat your question. It's not because we don't think you framed it poorly.
Yeah. There were a series of 4 outdoor performances over the summer. The first one was unfortunately rained out, so was the second. But I know, the third and the fourth went really well, and it was actually, like, we went to all of them because we live kind of close by, and it was a lot of fun to go see these kind of different performances. It's an artist colony that has, dancers, writers, all kinds of different artists, so all of the performances were kind of a different theme. So we went one night and there was a cabaret, and another night for a reading, like poetry readings, and it was a lot of fun to get to see all of the people from the community and Lake Forest come, and like Lake Forest is kind of a really
it's a wealthy
community.
Like where all the sports stars live from Chicago.
And Vince Vaughn.
And Vince Vaughn.
No, but there's a lot of wealth there, and so it was kind of fun to see those kinds of people come to this place and have to interact with a pillow in a weird way.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're supposed to be on a podcast about humor in like a week. And that's one of the things that I think is we don't think about, or we don't really think that much about how we do it. We just kind of do it. It kind of comes more intuitively to us. When we started working, we were both kind of angry with our situation. So Allison was unhappy with her job, and I was kind of unhappy with my job. And we just kind of started like, what do we want to do? Like, what do we think is cool? What is fun to us? And so we kind of tried to cultivate a tone in our work that was enjoyable to us. And I think what it does, though, to people interacting with it, I think that there's a certain way that we expect people, or we want the architecture to be engaged. And that's one where it's not threatening at first, that it's that people kind of get it right away, or they think they get it right away. But it's not superficial in that it ends there, but that as people engage with it even longer, they understand it as a kind of a more in-depth study than maybe it appears at first. So for us, humor is a way in. It's like a way to kind of capture people, but that we don't want it to stay there, because then it would just feel superficial and just kind of fall flat. But that, we often say that like we take fun seriously, and I think that's kind of true. Like we think it's a serious enterprise. These things that we're talking about, we think are fundamentally disciplinarily architectural, at the same time as we're kind of poking fun at things. But I think that's also a kind of we're trying to cultivate that Midwestern sense of kind of being in between. Like, is it like with the corn mural or the Corn Palace, there's this kind of sense that like you can't really take it that seriously because it's kind of a spectacle. At the same time, people identify with this thing, and it is a sincere experience that people have for it. And it's not irony, like it's different than irony. It's not like people poking fun at themselves or it, like people love it. Yeah. But there's it's funny and fun at the same time, and that's kind of what we're trying to figure out, like where that balance is. And it's kind of sometimes it's hard to like find that right tone. But yeah, so humor, it's there. People have written about it as satire, and I don't know if that's the right term for it. But it's there, but it comes more intuitively, I think, than we're trying to. We don't want to explain the joke either. Like we're not like searching for a theory of humor in architecture that we kind of go back to and like, this is funny because Charles Moore did it in 1986. But yeah, I think it kind of just comes more through what we want to do and how we want to engage people.
We forgot to say the question.
Oh. Yeah, so the question was asking about humor in architecture. Yeah. I don't feel like an outsider that, but outside of like this particular place. But yeah, I think I haven't gotten around Lincoln all that much, except for like the state capitol and everything. I think that's pretty amazing. I think though that my main interaction has been with the university and with the students, and so I think that. With the students, we've had a lot of fun just kind of like critically thinking about the surroundings. And so we'll do readings and think about what it means to be Midwestern, but also kind of just draw on our own experiences about what it means to be Midwestern and kind of adding that to the debate. And so I think that everyone's been really welcoming about thinking about this stuff deeper than just kind of like a kind of superficial stereotype. Because Midwesternness is so interesting because there's so many kind of contradictions at play. Like the fact that it's a territory but it has no boundaries. As we're finding in seminar, whenever anyone identifies as a kind of Midwestern cause, it's actually the cause of the universal or the entire nation. It's not like it's not like the South or the East or the West, which have like their own causes. It seems to be a stand-in for the universal. And so this question of Midwest, or even if Nebraska is part of the Midwest, like certain people would say, no, it's part of the West, or at least certain parts of it. So the fact that it kind of goes past state boundaries and state lines, this idea of Midwesternness, has been really interesting. And so we've been studying it from the context of Illinois, which is pretty clearly part of the Midwest. But then in Nebraska, which most of the students, I'd say they're Midwestern. But then there's questions about what that boundary is and kind of talking about what it means to even, like is it the difference between a rancher culture and an agricultural culture, or those sorts of things. But yeah, so my experience is mostly through the university, and that kind of testing this thesis within this other context. And I mean, this is only like the 4th or 5th week too, so I imagine that over the course of the,
Need a little time.
yeah, over the course of the semester, we'll be able to get out a little bit more and see more of it. That's, I mean, that's the, like where we feel we are right now in the development of our practice is we don't know where we think we're headed. We were at a certain stage when we were doing these like more speculative projects where we thought maybe that's just what we do. You know, maybe this is this is our niche. And then we started this within this last year when we moved to Chicago, and then all of a sudden it seemed like having a practice was a possibility. And then we won these competitions like back to back to back, and had to figure out a way to translate these sensibilities into built things, which was a big thing for us. Like those, like we don't want to see farmland built. Although we were contacted by a developer in China that wanted to build Farmland World. We were like, dude, don't you get like that it's kind of not supposed to be built? But we had to treat it seriously as if we wanted to build it. We had to price it out and everything. We had to scale it down because it was way too big, but treat it seriously. And we know we don't want to do that. Like we did not want Farmland World to be built. Like that was not the goal.
I didn't feel right about that.
It was not cool. So, but when we translated the temporary things, like we feel like we're getting onto something else, but we're also at the stage, well, maybe we just do temporary things. Like maybe we try to find that niche and kind of go into that world. But at the same time, maybe we could learn a lot by trying to translate that into more permanent structures. And I think we'd be up for it, but I think we're at that juncture and we don't know where it's headed. And we're excited to figure out what that is, but we don't have the answer as far as how it would do it, but it would definitely be the prevailing question over the next series of projects if we do end up going that way.
Yeah.
So if you have any answers for us, come find us.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't like the colors at Porch Parade anymore.
I don't like the way it blended.
Yeah, so the Porch Parade is CMYK without the K. It's just like cyan, magenta, and yellow. But normally if those things collide in pigment, they turn black. But instead, ours turns white. And so there's a bit of a, I don't know, I mean, it's not that important, but there's a bit of a kind of optical game there. It's behaving more like light than it is like pigment. So it's kind of counterintuitive the way it's blending. And I mean, that was kind of important. I mean, I think color
in general is important to us.
Sure, yeah. I think it's another one of those things that we haven't really theorized all that much as far as, I mean, obviously color is important to individual experience, and we care all deeply about individual experience and the way that people interact with architecture, and color seems to be important in that equation in some way. And so we deploy color, like we're not scared of it, but at the same time, like every time we use it really boldly, I feel like I don't really like the Porch Parade colors anymore. Like the colors of the cushions, I'm like, it's not quite the right color.
Yeah.
So we're not like experts at color,
No.
but we want to experiment with it. And so we think we're figuring something out.
We like to play with it.
We like to play with it, but we don't feel like we have a grasp on it yet. So that's a good question.
Yeah.
The question is about
That we did not
color,
repeat.
by the way. Color. I'll take it.
The question was.
The question was, how do we operate as architects? Basically, my interpretation of that question is like, how do we operate as architects when we're dealing with stories and qualitative things instead of quantitative things like numbers and sustainability and things like that, which can be quantified. How do we make decisions, right? Basically. Okay, sorry. That's what I understood. I feel like we approach architecture like an author does like a story. And authors know when something's good, like things resonate with people. And authors try to hone in on what things resonate and try to figure out what doesn't. And so in our work, we try to figure out what resonates and what speaks to people in various ways and try to operate on that. And I think that Farmland World, it's one of our earliest projects, but it tends to resonate with people because certain people read it as a project that's trying to argue for more sustainable farming practices. And that's not what we were thinking of when we did it, but people read that into it, and so it's on sustainability blogs. At the same time as it we meant it for one thing and people appropriated it for another. And so we think that this zone is really a great zone to be in. So doing things that people can appropriate and write their own narratives for. So the narrative for us is important to produce the architecture, but it's more important that it possess qualities that people can read their own narratives into it. And that's not a quantitative thing, it's a qualitative thing. But we're operating in that zone to figure out what forums and what projects and ways of operating can offer people to engage people in unexpected ways in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's necessary for everybody to understand the backstories of any of these projects. Like with Shawtown, like they didn't need to know they were like sitting and building parts to be able to appreciate them. The same with this one. Like I think that it's like an added layer that's there to it, and maybe it's only necessary for us to kind of make sense out of it and so feel comfortable kind of making decisions.
Yeah, and so in answer like more directly to your question, as we're working, as our design method kind of flows, we are always trying to design buildings, whether they live in the world or in a kind of fiction. The story is always in service of thinking about architecture in a different way. So if it doesn't do that, we don't want to pursue it. If the story and the decision that we're making if it only serves the backstory and doesn't allow people to engage in it in these alternative ways, we throw it out. So it has to operate in a number of ways, and that's how we start to make decisions that people can kind of read into it in different ways. Any other questions? No? All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate hospitality.